I collect rare and unusual plants, but I've been known to keep and even rescue certain invasives, especially in winter, when you're looking for something green and there's not much available. The word invasive has two definitions. It could mean a non-native plant that's been introduced, or a plant that's simply out of control. Crows are a native protected bird, and yet they muscle out songbirds, vultures, and other endemic birds anywhere from the Arctic Circle to the tropics. I joined an organization called PRISM that makes people invader detectives and removers. Nevertheless, as strange as this sounds, there are invasive species that are picky. The hammerhead worms are a genus of invasive flatworms that are so delicate they break if you pick them up. It's kind of hard to believe they're taking over. Here is a list of invasive species I've had a hard time growing and sometimes gave up entirely. You're welcome to post advice. However, the point of this video is the irony that each of these species is unwanted and hard to control, and yet there was something outside of the usual considerations that would not let it thrive, which could be useful to know as a limited factor instead of using herbicide. Lesser celandine is an invasive aquatic plant that is a problem for waterfront parks and wetlands. Whenever it floods, they get washed out of somebody's private pond and show up along the shoreline, which means it's possible to track them down to their source, which you can't do with most invasives. It's a beautiful plant, however, and I added one to my indoor water garden, in the soil it came with, in a pot so that it's contained and yet it always has wet feet. The leaves started turning yellow, and in a matter of weeks the plant was dead, even though the official literature says it can grow in any light and in any soil, and this wasn't winter but spring, which means I had to consider other possibilities like pH. The water in an aquarium goes down in pH over time, and there is no lesser celandine in the acidic swamps of the Carolinas and southern New Jersey. Creeping Jenny was first introduced to me as an invasive ground cover, which tends to escape from pots until it becomes a lawn. It is often introduced by bodies of water, however, even though it isn't aquatic nor does it like being mowed, so it grows in a narrow middle ground between lawns and rivers. I took some sprouts I found floating and added them to my water garden, expecting them to take over and muscle out the other plants, but it was the other way around. Then I put one in soil in a pot in the middle of the garden, and despite it having vines that reached down into the water, it was smaller at the end of the year than when I first potted it, because direct sunlight kept the soil dry, and the fronds that reached down into the water didn't even reach the glass or become self-sufficient from their own roots. So when it was time to bring the tank indoors for the winter, I found a pot with a little spout that allows pond water to come in. Portulaca. The purslanes are a genus of flowering succulents that appear out of mulch or bare soil, usually in the second half of the year, spreading rapidly and lasting quite late in the year due to its long taproot. Although it's a tropical perennial, it has become an annual. Coleus, by comparison, is only considered an annual because people allow it to freeze and then buy more in the spring. Its seeds don't come back next year, and yet Portulaca disappears until summer, as if that's what it's always done. But if you try to dig up and transplant this weed into a container, it will dry out in one day if it's in full sun, and it will die slowly if you bring it indoors to keep it moist. This is because the ground is perfectly layered to retain moisture and maintain a temperature gradient, so that even a plant that grows in just the top 2 to 3 inches can spend its entire life in full sun. You could try to recreate that, or better still, grow them from seed so you never have to transplant. Then it could go back to being a perennial, except that it's considered a weed. Smilax is the only native plant on this list. The greenbriers are a genus of over 300 species found worldwide. There are 3 species that are abundant in my area, and another 5 species I'm familiar with that grow on the coast. Although they're native to this area, the destruction of our virgin forests that had big empty spaces in them has left us with heavily impacted strips of land that are overgrown with greenbrier, multiflora rose, privets, and honeysuckles. So they're not a bad plant by themselves, but they've become a sign of a heavily impacted forest. Some of them are quite beautiful, like the laurel leaf greenbrier, and delicate like the lance leaf greenbrier. These coastal species are more exotic to me, so I put a cutting in water, and it never rooted, even though the reason vines have thorns and tendrils is so they can latch on to things and break off to start other plants. So when my friend dug up a 5-pound tuber out of his garden, I thought this was my chance and buried it in soil. Just sitting in the sun where my friend had discarded it killed it just as dead as the irradiated produce at the supermarket. Every part of it was dead, even though the reason for having a tuber, like a potato, is you can cut out any part of it and make a new plant. Smilax isn't difficult to grow, it was just hard to grow for me because of those 2 experiences. My last 2, water hyacinth and water lettuce, are both tropical floating plants. Like lesser celandine, they are introduced to bodies of water from private ponds when it floods. But unlike lesser celandine, which often blooms in winter, these are tropical, which means you have to bring them inside, and even then they usually die. Room temperature in winter is too chilly for them. And yet this past week, the last week of November, I harvested some water hyacinth left over from last year's flooding. I watched them freeze, I saw their rotten corpses in the spring, and yet they're back. But they don't want to be inside for more than a couple of months. Water lettuce at least leaves little offspring behind that can grow back next year. I could add watercress and muskgrass to this list. Watercress, which is a perennial, just died around the first frost as if it was outdoors. Muskgrass is a fully aquatic invasive that survives long periods of drought, which in my area doesn't show itself until the fall and lasts well into winter. But if you put it in an aquarium, it turns into mush. So I've seen examples of vines designed to break off which will not root, plants I found outdoors in winter that think the house is too cold, and plants that aren't happy with anything you give them, and yet they're opportunistic. Let me know what you think about this. Viva las plantas!